This is the occasional podcast for Theo Fantastique. I never have gotten into a regular kind of rhythm with this, but every once in a while we have an opportunity to talk to the friends who and colleagues who share an interest in horror, science fiction, fantasy, pop culture, religion, and all that kind of stuff. And that is certainly the case today. With we haven't had a whole lot of return guests. I think you are only the second return guest. Steve Wiggins. I think Doug Cowan has been back a number of times. But so, Steve, welcome back to Theo Fantastique.
Well, thank you. And I suspect that probably the quick return here is that the two books that we've talked about were published fairly quickly, one after the other. That's not my usual method of work, but they just happen to be very close in publication date.
Yeah, well, you've got a very brief bio on the back of your most recent book we're going to be talking about today, Nightmares with the Bible, the Good Book, and Cinematic Demons. And I am prepared today. I have my Exorcist coffee mug. So we are set. I couldn't find my Exorcist T-shirts. It was hidden in my monstrous T-shirt drawer. But it says Steve A. Wiggins, PhD, University of Edinburgh, is the author of Holy Horror, the Bible and Fear in Movies, the book that you came on the podcast and talked about previously. And he is an independent scholar. Anything you want to add to that, Steve?
Well, independent scholar is one of those terms that anybody really can use it, obviously, but quite often it means that you're a displaced academic or an unplaced academic, and that happens to be the case in my situation. I did teach for many years at an Episcopal seminary. There was some disagreement about various issues that led to my changing careers. And so I'm not actually teaching anymore, although I have taught occasionally as an adjunct at places like Rutgers University, Montclair State University, the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh when I was still living in Wisconsin. So I've got an academic background, and I continue to try my research chops, even though it's not a part of my daily work's expectation anymore. Once you've started down that road of doing research, I think many of us feel that we really can't give it up. And that's what really fits, I think, my situation.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's more satisfaction in doing the research to make sure you can maintain your academic position with an institution or just doing it for self-enjoyment. But yeah, you certainly do good work. I appreciate what you do.
Well, thank you. Yes, and I think that for me, the enjoyment aspect is clearly what it was. It actually happened a number of years ago. I realized that I had been doing research, even though I didn't think of it as research. I'd been reading lots of books on horror genre, and I really came as kind of a bolt out of the blue that, hey, there's a book to be written here. And so Nightmares with the Bible was kind of a follow-on book, largely spurred on by the fact that a new series has been started by Fortress Academic and Lexington Books, Horror and Scriptures, and so, or Scripture and Horror, I can't remember, I can never keep the order straight. And that series was announced I think probably the same week that I received a contract for Nightmares with for Holy Horror, which was obviously would have been perfect for that series. And so I worked to put together some ideas for another book for that, for my follow-up book to Holy Horror, which is what Nightmares in the Bible, Nightmares with the Bible is about, really is. It's the follow-up from the previous one, but focusing specifically on possession movies.
Okay. Now, one of the reasons I like talking to you is you and I have similar passions. We somehow combine an interest in the academic study of religion and the Bible with horror in its various manifestations. I'm sure we talked about it when you came on and promoted your other book, but help me understand, how is it that you personally developed this passion, and then how did it end up later being connected to your academic work?
Yeah, I think for me, it was, I was a monster boomer. I grew up watching horror movies. I also grew up as an evangelical Christian. So the two never struck me as being in any way in conflict. I just thought that they were different parts of life. I think I, like most kids who grew up doing that sort of thing, when you become an academic, you sort of move away from it because it's childish and it's, all it's not very respectable, and that's still an issue with horror studies. I think in general is that it is considered to be not a really sophisticated genre. And what happened was, after I lost my job that I was talking about earlier, I started using horror movies as a way of coping with all kinds of issues. And that was, for me, kind of a turning point. I realized that I was getting something out of watching these movies. And when I realized that that was happening for me, I realized slowly that it happens for other people as well. And so as I read more about horror, because I was kind of trying to figure out, why am I doing this? Why am I sitting here watching scary movies? That doesn't make a lot of sense. But as I started to explore that, I started to realize other people who had religious backgrounds were also doing a similar sort of thing. And I thought, this is worth exploring. And so the idea behind Nightmares with the Bible was really a follow-up for the Holy Horror book, because it was looking specifically at a chapter in that book, which was about demons. And instead of looking at demons as how they're presented necessarily in the Bible, I was curious about how they're presented in cinema. And the Bible part of it, of course, comes in the first half of the book, which sort of does a survey of where our ideas about demons come from. And my reading on it really gave me a very strong, and I'm glad you've got your Exorcist mug there, a very strong indication that our perception of demons in modern day Western society comes from The Exorcist. And that really the horror movie genre bears that out. If you start looking at movies and see, where do these ideas of demons come from? They come from The Exorcist. And yeah, it was there before The Exorcist, but that really kind of solidified the idea.
So basically, it was used the academic aspect of it came about because you had that interest and you saw others kind of pursuing that, and you thought you would pursue it
Mhm.
as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's very much what it is. I saw that this is something that you could be done, and you mentioned earlier on that Doug Cowan had been your repeat guest. It was his book, Sacred Terror, which first made me realize that yes, you could approach this academically, and you could actually say something intelligent about these movies instead of just saying, "Well, this is really cool," or "This happened and it made me think that." There's actually some depth to this that could be explored, and so I'm trying to find that balance of finding something worth saying about these movies, but also at the same time saying something about the Bible and the way we look at the Bible.
Mm-hmm. Now, you said something in your previous answer about how horror didn't have much academic. I don't know if it was academic respectability or just respectability. Do you think that might be changing? I mean, when I started Theophantastique, it was basically a way for me to kind of share my reflections, my thoughts on religion in these various genres. And but then I started finding academic treatments, and I didn't see anybody else talking about it. And so I started blogging on it, and I got in touch with some of the authors and said, "Do you want to talk about it?" And they were all too willing to do so. And that was years ago. And now we've got, a few journals dealing with this kind of thing and more academic books. Having said all that, do you think maybe we're starting to turn a corner, at least in one segment of the academy?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that probably the safest way to deal with it at first seems to have been in film studies. That seems obvious because horror movies are movies, and therefore cinematography experts would like to deal with them and talk about them. And I think that gave us some indication of where the field could go. But biblical studies and religious studies especially seem to be fields that draw on what's going on in other fields. And so I think that it has gained respectability even in this area. So you start seeing some major presses publishing in the area. There are a number of places that actually have books that deal with horror and religion. This was a new thing. When Doug's book came out, I can't remember exactly when it was, 2006, 2008, something like that. It was such a different thing. Nobody else had been doing it. But since that time, I see other indications that academics are starting to say, yeah, this is of interest. And of course, at the Society of Biblical Literature and American Academy of Religion annual meeting, there were, for a few years, some sessions that I helped to organize that were dealing with issues of monstrosity and religion. And the thing that became clear to me is that mostly younger scholars, not all, but mostly younger scholars were really interested in this. And it's an area that has started to grow. I'm seeing dissertations being written on it. We're seeing presses being willing to publish in it, and even websites that are starting to discuss the issues of religion and horror. I've been a guest blogger on a site called Horror Homeroom,
Mm-hmm.
which deals with these issues. And they're very receptive to it. So I think it's becoming more acceptable to look at the mix of things. And horror in general, I think, is becoming more acceptable because there's a lot of intelligent horror out there, and I think people are starting to see it.
Yeah, I had the pleasure of writing a review of your book here, Nightmares of the Bible, for Horror Homeroom, and thank you for helping me get a copy so that I could do that. Now, you mentioned earlier on that you had done your previous book, Holy Horror, and then you had a quick turnaround to try and develop something which became Nightmares with the Bible. Was this for you kind of the next natural step after Holy Horror?
Well, actually, yeah, it's a good question. And my thought was I was trying to figure out, should I do a sequel book? Because the one of the things that distinguished Holy Horror is I did not discuss sequels. And the reason I didn't discuss sequels is simply because the story changes between one movie and the next. And we see that all the time. I mean, as anybody who watches movies in a series knows, you can't keep the storyline consistent. And so I thought that's opening a whole new can of worms, if you're wanting to talk about that. And so I started writing a book on that, and I realized that I couldn't just approach that question alone and make an entire book of it. But if you look at it in terms of a specific type of horror movie, and so the one that leapt out at me was the possession movies, you really could, because many possession movies have sequels and sequels and sequels. They just become um, so popular that they just keep running on and on and on. Probably the best example of that is the Amityville horror series, which keeps on churning out stuff. And it really kind of sank after the third movie, but still it doesn't stop people from doing it. There's a lot of interest, and it still makes money. Obviously Holly wouldn't be producing these kinds of things if it wasn't making money. So there's an interest there. And the other, I suppose, deciding factor was the Conjuring series, which I've been following quite avidly, because all of those movies deal with demons in some way or another. And these are the places that people are getting their answers for the questions of what demons are. They watch the movies, and here's something that the movies are willing to address, but academics aren't often very comfortable addressing. It's like, well, as you can't take that seriously, it's not an academic topic. But and even since then, I have to say I've seen a lot more academic books on demons coming out. There seems to be a real kind of interest in at the moment of this particular topic, and it seemed to be a nice kind of collection of things to look at for a follow-up to looking at how movies influence our perceptions of what's going on in the biblical world.
Yeah, like you mentioned, there is this continued interest with this. Your book is dealing with topics like demonic possession, Satan, hell, those kinds of things. We see this all the time in horror films, and even outside of horror films. There was a recent controversy with a rapper who did a music video with him going to hell and giving Satan a lap dance and breaking his neck and taking over, Satan's position. What do you think it is about us in this cultural moment that why are these things continually of interest to us, these topics in horror or elsewhere?
Well, I tend to think a larger sociological, I don't know if that's even the right word, and maybe anthropological view of it, and that is that our culture is so biblically based, and we are in denial about that. We've been in denial about it for a long time. Culture is becoming more and more secular, but at the same time, the basis for so much of what we do is biblical, and the Bible has become, with a certain caveats, of course, less visible in our culture because people don't read it. It's not, it's kind of laughed at. And we don't realize just how much it influences our culture until something happens to insult people. Another example, besides the rapper, is that the release of, I'm forgetting the name of the film, The Unholy, was it, that came out on
Yes.
Good Friday?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And there was a bit of concern about that. It's like, this is Good Friday. Why is a horror film being released on Good Friday? Well, why are we concerned about Good Friday if our society isn't already based on the premise that this day is somehow special, somehow different? Where does that come from? It comes from an understanding of the Bible. So I think we're at a nexus in our cultural development where we're seeing the underlying strata is being questioned and maybe even eroded, but it's still very powerful and it holds on to it. And so we get these cross messages, these mixed messages that have people saying, well, don't believe in demons, don't believe in spiritual beings, but this possession stuff is scary. And at the same time, we don't know what it is. And so there's this kind of mix of things. I think it just is perfect timing for trying to make some sense of these ancient ideas that just won't let go.
I think, especially conservative religious believers, but even people who may not consider themselves religious, might have the assumption that what we see in cinema, or what we think of in terms of the concepts of Satan and demons and possession, there's a clear narrative in the Bible, and what we're doing is just taking that out, and that's being portrayed. And yet, one of the things that I think, especially conservative religious believers, might find unsettling about your book is it points out that the development of the concept of demons is not at all simple or clear in black and white. There was a development to that process. Can you share a little bit about that? How we can unpack and understand some of that?
Yeah, that was one of the things that really became clear to me, because this book was actually the fusion of two different books. One was I started out as a history of demons, because when I started writing it, there wasn't anything out there for regular readers. I mean, there was a lot of academic stuff, but nothing really for regular readers. And so I thought, well, and that's changing. I mean, even since the book has come out, I've seen lots of people who are trying to address this, and in books that will be coming out shortly. So the question was, what is a demon? And because when I wrote the chapter on possession in Holy Horror, the question really came back to me in a very real way. It was, well, what are we talking about here? Because the different movies that I talked about in that book had different perceptions of what demons were. Is it an entity that's never been human, which is kind of popular in the ghost hunting world. Like the television series Ghost Hunters, they quite often use that. This is an entity that was never human. That goes back to Ed and Lorraine Warren's perception of what demons were. And there's the other perception, they're fallen angels, or they are servants of Satan, and Satan may be a fallen angel, or maybe this anti-God creature that was there from the beginning. And so I started to look back at this and try to trace things backwards, which I think really makes a lot of sense to me, is just try to see where they come from. And the earliest written records we have, of course, are from the ancient Near East, from Sumer and from Mesopotamia, Acadia, or not Acadia, Assyria and Babylonia. They all know about demons. They're already in place from the very beginning. The earliest written records, there's never any question that they're there. They were assumed to be real. And the one thing they don't do is really address what they are. They don't talk about their backstory, because everybody knew what demons were. And so those cultures clearly influenced the Bible in some ways. In the biblical world, they had different views of demons too. I mean, they're not really described. They're actually very rarely mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, very rarely. So where we see them all of a sudden coming to prominence is in the New Testament, where Jesus is casting demons out. He's exorcising people. And the demons that we get in the New Testament world reflect largely a Greek view of what demons were. And the Greeks did not have this view, excuse me, of demons that were necessarily negative. Their view is that they were spiritual beings, and they could influence things for good or for evil, which is also true of the Mesopotamian demons. They were not necessarily evil. What they do to people looks like evil, because what happens to us is inevitably not good if a demon gets a hold of us. But from the point of view of the world, the natural world, they weren't necessarily evil. But in the New Testament, we get that personality of a demon that is evil. It's in trying to harm somebody. The story of Legion is a very good example of that. This demon is tormenting this man. These demons are tormenting this man. And so this is a very different kind of creature. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized that there were a number of different things that could be called demons in the ancient world. And there was nobody systematizing this. So you get stories in Josephus and other places where demons are evil ghosts. I mean, they're essentially dead people who didn't move on the right way. And of course, in the biblical world, there was no hell yet. That was something developed a little bit later on in time. So these are unsettled spirits of evil people who never quite made it to where they were. They're not fallen angels. In other places, they are fallen angels. In other places, they're elemental spirits, what they might be called elementals in today's terminology. So there wasn't any authority that could tell us what demons were. I mean, like if you stop to think about it, the church, you've got in the Catholic Church, you've got the magisterium, you've got the teaching authority of the church. They can declare doctrine, but in the early days, that wasn't there. There was no such body in Judaism that determined what was the official point of view. And so you've got these ideas loosely lying around of what demons are. And where they really finally come to a fixed picture is with The Exorcist. I think that's where you start to get an idea of, here we have demons and we understand them as being evil spirits. They're possessing somebody with the intent to harm, and they are, it doesn't actually say fallen angels, but you get this very strong suspicion that they are, and that kind of builds from there. So it's kind of like all these ideas sort of bottleneck down to The Exorcist, and then they balloon out again. It's kind of an hourglass shape. So now we've got demons that are all kinds of different creatures in popular culture, but they all trace their origin back in some way to The Exorcist.
As I listened to you talk and as I read your book, I was struck by this synergy, this mutual influence between the biblical text and how people read it, and horror films and pop culture. Do you think most people are aware of this back and forth, this mutual influence, and the assumption that what I'm seeing in a horror film is biblical, or how's that relationship work itself out?
Yeah, I don't think they are. And I think that what's happening is that because people don't actually turn to the Bible too much themselves to find out, if you want to find information on demons, it's a little bit easier now that the internet's there. But if you pick up a physical Bible and start looking, it's hard to find the information. It's scattered all over the place and it's not uniform. And so where do people get information? Well, we get our information from popular culture. I mean, I think that more and more people understand the Bible as popular culture presents it. This became evident to me when I was teaching, because at the time, and I discussed this actually in Holy Horror, but the movie Pulp Fiction was quite popular during my teaching days. And people could quote that verse from Ezekiel that Samuel L. Jackson quotes throughout the movie, and they could quote you chapter and verse. But the thing is, it's not in the Bible. It's not a biblical verse. And that made me realize that, and these were seminary students. I mean, these were people going on to ministry, that they were learning about the Bible from popular culture. And if seminarians are learning about it from popular culture, then what about the rest of the world? And yes, sure enough, you found lots of people who were getting their information about what's in the Bible. It's a big book. It takes a long time to read. And if you're going to read it multiple times, you're talking about years of commitment to do this. So why not just say, well, the movies showed me that was where it was, or other popular culture. I mean, I don't think there's quite as much of that in, say, the literary world where people read it from novels or things, but movies are so powerful. You see them very quickly. They take a couple hours of your life, but you've got information. You're getting information, and a lot of people don't bother to check it up or to do the research and find out where did they get their information. And that's what I was trying to do.
Yeah, these things, for better or worse, have a significant influence. One of the things that drives me nuts is watching a horror film or a horror television program, and they're referring to the Book of Revelation, and it's always Revelations, and I just scream at the television set. But and I'm thinking of the Omen, where they're sitting down, the diplomat and the photographer, and they're reading a fictitious text allegedly from the Book of Revelation. I think he says Revelations in the film as well. And it's completely fictitious, but I don't know how many times have had people just assumed that was a real part of the biblical text. So that there is this back and forth kind of influence, and it's difficult, I think, sometimes for people to know where the biblical text leaves off and Hollywood starts to take over. So I thought that was interesting insight of yours that you brought there. Were there any major aha moments or anything when you were writing this book, or was it basically something you'd been thinking about for years and this was just kind of a way for you to process and get it out?
Yeah, I think so. I think, and I hate to keep coming back to The Exorcist, but I think the aha moment came when I was doing the research for this and realizing that how many people were referring to The Exorcist at various stages. I'm talking about scholars, I'm talking about popular writers, that they keep coming back to this point that almost the demons themselves were invented by The Exorcist. It's not to say that I'm not making a statement about what my personal beliefs are here, but our cultural perception of demons comes from that movie. And that was kind of an aha moment, because for me, I grew up not watching The Exorcist. I was afraid of it. I did not see it until I was in my 40s. I was afraid to even sit down and watch it, because as I was growing up, and then I was a teenager in the 70s, there was there were people saying this is the scariest movie ever, and I was terrified to watch it, and I realized that it's just become such a cultural phenomenon, and that I'm always fascinated when a large cultural phenomenon grows from a small place. And prior to The Exorcist, yeah, there were demon movies. There have been demon movies from the beginning of horror movies. There have been a few of them around, but they didn't really capture the cultural moment like The Exorcist did. And I don't know what it was about the 70s. A lot of stuff was going on then,
Mhm.
but that movie caught a moment and gave us essentially a new monster for horror movies. The demon was suddenly the in thing, and there were all kinds of places that it's gone, and I don't see it slowing down at all. And you're quite right about the give and take, by the way, with Revelations and Revelation. My favorite story about that is the first season of the Fox television series Sleepy Hollow, which came out in 2013. The first episode, the pilot episode, they kept on referring to Revelations, but in the second episode they corrected it. So they realized that they had
Right.
done something wrong. But yeah, so there is that give and take. I think it does exist.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Now, you in your book here, you've got chapters devoted to a discussion of various films: The Conjuring universe, Amityville, Paranormal Activities, and of course, as you've already mentioned a number of times, The Exorcist. Why did you select these films out of all the films that deal with this topic?
Yeah, the reason that I chose them is because the book originally started, as I say, as two separate projects. One was the sequel project, and the other was the Demon project. And the sequels were with those particular movies. They seemed to be the ones that kept the story going. So Paranormal Activities, started with Paranormal Activity, of course, but that series just kept on building on this same premise and got to the point where, frankly, by the end of it, it was ridiculous. I think by the time you got to the end, it just didn't hold up. But I see even now that they're planning another movie in that series, so it's going. There's going to be more to say about that. But I think it was largely because these franchises were the ones that kind of really caught the popular imagination. Amityville Horror was an extremely popular movie when it first came out, and I think it's not so much anymore, but it was. And the Conjuring movies, that series in horror film history is the most lucrative series of horror films or monster movies, with the exception of the Godzilla series, which had a much earlier start, of course, began in the 50s with the Godzilla movies. The Godzilla franchise is probably is the most highest grossing horror series ever. But the second is The Conjuring. They have raked in the money. And that keeps on telling me that people are really fascinated by this. There's an interest there. There could have been, of course, another way of approaching this, which would be to simply look at individual snippets of movies that have possession, and there are a lot of them. But this seemed to give the book a bit more coherence. And so when I was trying to put it together and saying, well, I've got a bunch of horror movies that are sequels here, and I've got demons over here, then these seem to fit together into one package.
Mhm. Now, if you had to pick your own personal favorite, is it in the mix here of what you covered, or is it something that wasn't covered, but it still really does it for you in
Oh,
terms of bringing them together?
yeah, there's really, I can't say that there's a specific favorite, but I have to say that The Exorcist keeps coming back as a movie that rewards watching over and over. I mean, I've read books by other film critics and people who write about horror who say that people laugh at it now, the effects are
Right.
dated and everything, but it is still a very scary movie. I mean, if you take it at its premise in the world in which it exists, it's diegesis. It is a scary movie, and I don't think it's been surpassed. I mean, I think that people have tried. There come points where for me, when I'm watching a movie, there has to be kind of a narrative coherence, and the Exorcist just did it well. And the best example of how it falls apart is in the sequels, because I didn't even know there were sequels to The Exorcist until I started researching this book. And then I started to watch them, and they just didn't measure up. They just couldn't quite come to that level again. And The Conjuring, there there are elements there that I think are very good and are strong, and this certainly is entertaining. I mean, I enjoy watching all those movies, um, but I don't think they quite get the gravitas that The Exorcist does. And I think maybe that's it. You walk out of the theater or out of your living room or wherever you watched it after seeing The Exorcist thinking that was plausible. You know, that was plausible. The others, there's a little bit of, they go over the top, but there's something, there's a kind of a realism there. Maybe it was William Friedkin who, you know, had that kind of realism in his past directorial experience. Maybe it was the combination of Friedkin and Blatty together. I don't know what it was. There was some chemistry there, but that movie just seemed to me to be the, I would be very surprised if anybody can ever produce an exorcism movie that surpasses The Exorcist. I mean, that it just it came at the right cultural time, but it also it just produced a feeling, a sensation that I have not seen any other movie do, and it's been what 50 years now, and nobody's actually come that close.
Yeah, I've read treatments by scholars as well, where they say they show them to their classes and they get laughter from the students, and that will be another of my frustrations, is that even though we bring our present moment and our experience and so on to film watching, I think we have to try and understand and approach something within its own historical and cultural context. I mean, you can make fun of anything, but I still think the original King Kong holds up as perhaps the best treatment of that, even though it's got its shortcomings because of when it was made. But so I think The Exorcist, like you're saying, does still hold up if we can enter into it on its own terms. It still does provide some horrific responses on the part of our watching it here. Do you have any other books in the works? Anything you want to announce that you're working on?
Nothing that I want to announce just yet, but
Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
my problem is I tend to work on things in parallel. So that you see this coming together in Nightmares with the Bible, because this was two separate books that I brought together. I don't plan on bringing any others together, but I've got three separate books that I'm currently working on, and there's one front runner at the moment that it's kind of a yet another follow up here, but taking it in quite a different direction from these two books. And I've got some others that are really looking at the historical questions behind some of the movies and trying to make sense of those. So I've got at this point, I say three of them going. Who knows if any of them ever get finished? I don't have an access to an academic library, so it really depends on when I can get get a hold of the sources and what what I can do from my background reading. And I love doing these books about movies, but you need to be able to watch the movies and finding the time to watch the movies and to watch them over and over again so you can get a sense of what's really going on. It's a challenge.
Yeah, it is. Well, whenever you figure it out and get it published, you've always got a place to come and talk about it here at Theo Fantastique.
Oh,
Is there
thank you.
anything else you want folks to take away from this great book, Nightmares with the Bible?
I'd just say that my main takeaway, or what I hope my main takeaway from it is to pay attention to what popular culture says and take it seriously. I think that one of the biggest mistakes that we make as academics or pseudo academics or whatever you want to call us, or independent scholars, or even in the academy, is to not take popular culture seriously. We say, it's just popular culture. But in fact, that is where people are getting their information. And we do well to pay attention to it. I think it has all kinds of ramifications, not just for religious studies, for politics, for all kinds of things. We need to pay attention to what people see and what they believe and where they get their information. That's the main thing for me.
Yeah, I think I couldn't agree more. It's fascinating. I do some stuff in multi-faith engagement and conflict and that kind of thing. And then I do work in the area of theofantastique, horror, science fiction, fantasy, and religion. And recently we had a book come out that I co-edited with Brandon Graffius that you contributed to on theology and horror. And when I promoted that on my Facebook page, I've got 81 folks so far last time I looked who clicked like or made comments. I never get that kind of response when I'm talking about just religion in and of itself. So I have always over the years, that's why I started Theo Fantastique. I can talk about religious things if I do it through the venue of pop culture and entertainment, and people are that's where people live. And so I think you're definitely on the right track here in trying to bring these things together. And so I always appreciate our conversations, Steve. And this is a great book. Folks will find with this video on the Theo Fantastique blog a link to the book. And I would encourage folks, if you can, it's an academic book, hardcover, might break the piggy bank. But if folks can't afford it for their personal library, there's always interlibrary loan. I've done tons of that from my research. And I would just encourage folks to pick up a copy. And I can't wait till the next time you come back, Steve.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you for your great work on Theofantastique. I mean, that website was very formative in my own early thinking about this, and you're doing great work. So thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, it's good to know still got readers. I appreciate it. Thanks again. This has been Steve Wiggins on the Theofantastique podcast conversation. Thanks again.